Thank you, Sue. I'm just going to test, this is Suzanne here speaking, I'm just briefly going to test this that works. We should go back to the, right, okay. My name is Sue Bell, and as Sue York just mentioned, I'm here in conversation with my friend and colleague Suzanne Burdon, talking about the challenges of BE for qualitative research. This presentation is also very much a result of the many conversations we've already had, toing and froing about the best way to use behavioural economics and what value it does or doesn't have. Now, this is something I've been thinking about for a long time. I've been interested in the psychology behind behavioural economics, particularly that type known as social cognition, which is to do with biases and heuristics principally in this context. Suzanne and I and some co-authors have written some papers which relate to this, which were presented at Amherst conferences in 2004 and 2007, and one in the International Journal of Market Research. And in particular, there we were looking at what Daniel Kahneman calls System 1 thinking, also very much related to that sort of blink type thinking, if people remember Malcolm Gladwell's book. I've also included there the icon from NewMR to refer to the discourse analysis webinars that I've been giving over the last months or so, because there are some interestingly and perhaps unexpected connections between discourse analysis and behavioural economics.
Yeah, hi, I'm Suzanne, and in some of my conversations, I've been a bit of the devil's advocate. And one of the things I keep coming back to is that as researchers, the structure of the research task has always and typically been to use quantitative research to measure behaviour, and then to use qualitative research to explore the meaning behind that behaviour. And now BE comes along, all bright and shiny new, and says it's all about understanding behaviour, and it feels as if it's pushing qual off the block. And I think it's really important that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Our nice baby.
Slides are sometimes a little sorry coming up, sorry. And I agree with that definitely, that we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So what we've done, what we need to do is to evaluate what the strengths of BE are for research and what how we can blend it with the best of research. Effectively, that's where we're going. So we don't simply want to just jump in and adopt it willy-nilly, if you like, but to evaluate what we're doing. So the next slide that will come up in a minute is a summary of the real strengths of BE for research as we see them. So it's about the aspects of BE that we want to take into qual. That's what we've done. We've looked at what BE has to offer and said there are certain things, certain implications that it has for qualitative research. And the 5 that we're focused on are that consumers are subject to cognitive biases, that consumers are irrational and often use emotion and heuristics to decide, that context and frames influence behaviour, that social influence is stronger than we are aware of, and that cultural influences have real impact on behaviour. Now, I think someone might say to this, so we knew this already. The benefit of BE for qualitative research is that it puts this into a framework. This then shapes your thinking. What we're actually going to be talking about in many ways is using BE to help us plan our research as much as anything.
Mm-hmm. I'm also concerned, though, that BE has its weaknesses for researchers. So much of the major work that's been done has focused on how BE helps change behaviour in a social context. I mean, Ray mentioned organ donors, Bree mentioned energy saving, and that's all lovely and very important, and it's important when we do social research work for us as well. However, it is a bit limited so far in what it's offered us. Also, it tends to focus on the bad decision that consumers make, how to stop people doing bad things like being overweight or smoking. And it hasn't spent a lot of time on trying to understand the more positive decision. In some markets, there's a body of very savvy consumers out there who do have, very strong things to say in their own right. And the other problem is that it can be too prescriptive. I think there's a real danger that we put blinkers on and of limiting the broad and the open-minded approach that's always characterized good research and good committed researchers as well. Not only that, BE has actually challenged the validity of qualitative research. It seems to take a really strong stance and to try and overtake and overcome qualitative research, which can be seen in some of the statements of the experts. I mean, to say things like behavioural economics challenges the validity of relying solely on asking consumers direct questions is a very extreme statement. And other people have said things like, forget market research, it's all about understanding behavioural economics. And that's where I get a little bit paranoid, because I think that's really help we're being taken over here. And then other people like Dan Irely, who Ray mentioned as well, says some really definitive things like focus groups make very little sense. And I think this is where I get Sue on side, because
it is indeed. Now, before I say anything more about this and about the current slide, is that I have, of course, the greatest respect for Professor Irely and his work in behavioural economics and his book, Predictably Irrational, and his TED Talks, which are very good. But there is one area in which I disagree, and I think probably other people listening might disagree. This is a quote from Dan Irely from the website bigthink.com, and he has a video there about focus groups, which is where Suzanne's quote came from. And this is what he says a focus group is. We take 10 people who basically know nothing about your project, and you put them in a room and let them talk for a while. Then you take whatever they came up with as a consequence of these 2 hours of random thinking, and you base your strategy on it. Now that bears no resemblance whatsoever to any focus group I've ever seen, and certainly
or run, absolutely not.
Absolutely not. So what we could do is, well, the first thing I think we have to do is that when we're talking about what BE can do for qualitative research, we need to do it from the perspective of qualitative researchers. We know what it's all about. These kinds of statements are provocative but not necessarily useful. But I'd also like to do something different here with this, which is I'd like you to imagine that this is a verbatim quote from some qual about qual. So let's imagine we've done some groups actually about focus groups.
Okay.
And we've seen this as a verbatim quote. Now what we might think from a traditional qual perspective is that this person has a negative attitude to qual. We would call it a negative attitude.
Yes.
But if instead of taking a traditional qual approach, we take a behavioural economics approach and the psychology behind that, what we might do, and this is a guess, what we might do is say this quote exhibits stereotyping bias. It is possible that the poor soul has in fact come across a group exactly like this and now assumes they're all like that. Now that's what I like about behavioural economics, because it potentially can be much more precise in its diagnosis of the things that predict behaviour than just saying this person has a negative attitude. And being more precise in diagnosis leads to more precise recommendations.
I guess I can say that makes me feel a little bit better about Mr. Irely.
Oh, that's good. So this slide is about a new model. I don't mean a proprietary model here. What we're looking at is a framework for thinking, and it's a framework for thinking about how to bring the best of BE into the best research. And from a qualitative research perspective, what that means is that, yes, in fact, we do have to throw some bathwater away. There is some kind of research which is not compatible with behavioural economics, and it's not the best research, to be truthful. But there is some research, some qualitative research, which, like the baby, we need to keep. What we do then is add that to the best of BE for research with those 5 things that we looked at before. And what we come up with, we believe, is a more mature and a stronger approach to qualitative research from now on.
Does our approach mean that we hire a research assistant that looks like that?
I think it could. So I've mentioned that we do need to throw some bathwater away. In other words, we need to throw away some sort of research that is incompatible with behavioural economics. So we need to throw away the kind of research that assumes that people can report on their own thinking processes. To be truthful, we knew this already, but we just need to recognise that we shouldn't do it anymore. We need to throw away research that assumes that consumers will always want a superior product. Now, I think this is in many ways a new thought, because a lot of our research, a lot of marketing research, is about how can we get people to buy things. New Coke being a good example. And there's sort of an assumption, an implicit one, that people will want a superior product. So we ask them to evaluate and describe the advantages and so on. Well, actually, they're really quite comfortable with the status quo, thank you very much. We also need to throw away our focus on attitude, our focus on individuals, and we need to throw away any research, as Ray has already pointed out, that ignores context and ignores social effects.
Well, I agree with all that, and I think that's all is important things that we do want to get rid of. We have to remember that we need to keep good research that brings the world of the consumer to life and helps clients understand people as people and not just picking products off shelves, and helps tease out alternative positions. I mean, for instance, we wouldn't want to lose, would we, that lovely progressive learning that happens in groups, you know, where a good moderator can work with the respondents to make that happen. We wouldn't want to lose how we unravel complex decision processes. For instance, I mean, the work we've just done, Sue, you and I, on investment and insurance involved lots of complex thinking, and we needed to tease that out in very researchy sort of ways. And we help people talk about personal issues, and that very much depends on the personal skill of the researcher. Things that reveal an individual's emotional inner world, and we have already a well-developed toolbox to help that process, things like projective techniques and metaphor elicitation, etc., and to learn the language that the consumer uses.
So we've thrown away some things from research,
yep,
and we've kept the best of it, and then what we need to do is accept the BE challenge, which is to put behaviour first, use more precise models of thinking, and to expect greater scientific rigour. So, the question is how? Here are some questions that one might ask of behavioural economics. How is it actually done? Can it work in a small qual study? Is a good question.
Can clients afford it? Are we creating something that's bigger than Ben-Hur and will be ridiculously impractical?
And I don't think it has to be.
No.
Does it take too long? Again, the same answer. It doesn't have to.
And then it comes down to how do you actually do it?
Okay.
In practical terms, in the nuts and bolts.
In practical terms. So what we did as a way of working out how to actually do it was to come up with a pretend brief, effectively, and say, well, given this brief, how would we write the proposal, a BE-inspired proposal for qualitative research, and what implications would that then have for the report? So our pretend brief is, to be honest, one I've used before. It's where a charity client, we're saying, has seen their donations falling and their membership has stagnated, and they want to commission qualitative research with consumers to find out why. So what we would do, of course, is to turn their problem into a research objective. And if we're going to turn it into a research objective, we, from a BE perspective, we talk about behaviour. So we want to understand behaviour and the triggers that and the barriers to that behaviour. And then it becomes a question of the research design and the research method. I've got here, I think, one of the most important points, which is that what we need to do from a research method point of view is to use mixed methods to triangulate. Now, what I mean by that, mixed methods, of course, you understand, but face-to-face focus groups, online focus groups, depth interviews, observation.
Is that different to what we've done before?
Well, it is. I mean, I know we've used mixed methods before, but the reason we need to do them from a BE perspective is actually to see if we come up with the same answer from each method. So what we've done before, perhaps, is to use different methods for different types of respondents. Or we've said, oh, we're not going to find out this in Greeks. We'll have to do observation. We'll find out different things with different methods. The reason we need to do it here is because, for example, as an example, if we had a focus group, if we just relied on focus groups for a finding, we couldn't really tell without doing some other research how much social influence had an impact on the outcome of that particular part. So we're triangulating in order to find out the same result.
Yes, yes. And so should we also think, as part of the methodology discussion, how we recruit people? For instance, should we be recruiting on behaviour rather than on usage, attitude or demography, as we quite often have?
Definitely. And in some ways, the implications of BE for qualitative research are in the back room, so to speak, in terms of how we actually spec our groups or clubs or whatever they are. But also there is another implication which also has a back room, which is one of the real implications for the research method, in fact, of BE, is the client behind the mirror.
Yes, of course.
Ray has talked about the importance of context. We are passionate, I think, about making sure that research is conducted within an authentic context, and we seriously have to think about how applicable it is to have that client behind the model. There's probably a whole new discussion in that. But what we then need to do is to think about what we're actually going to ask people in whichever method we're going to use. And I've listed some here. I won't go through all of them, but it's, you know how normally in a traditional qual project we think about what kind of things can these people tell us? Well, will we need a projective for this? What kind of projective for this will we need for this? Will metaphors work, etc., etc. This is the same kind of thing, but it's doing it from a BE point of view. So what we would say is, what biases and heuristics are these people likely to be suffering from, if that's the right phrase, and how should we overcome that in our questioning? So the first one is accessibility heuristic, which I think Bree characterized as potency or one of those, which is the idea that people will simply talk about the thing that comes most quickly to mind. And it's quite possible that from our charity perspective, that what will come most quickly to mind is being accosted in the street by a charity collector or getting a phone call being pressured to donate. Now, while that's an important thing to cover, we have to be very clear and have to be very careful that that doesn't dominate the discussion. And anchoring is the same. Anchoring is usually used when talking about pricing, but you can also think about it from a product point of view. So what can happen in a group discussion is that people, or an interview, is that people can anchor onto a particular product feature or aspect of the service experience and just never move off it. Anchors can be very strong. And so what we need to do from a plan to do from a topic guide point of view is to expect the anchors and work out how to de-anchor.
Okay.
And some of those other ones which are on our list here will come on the next page.
So I really need to get down and dirty and practical about actually how we do this. So if we can just go through those and look at what methods we might use. So with the accessibility heuristic, for instance, I mean, I suppose, and we've sort of thought about this before, but I think one probably thing that would work is to use discourse analysis as a stage one to create stimulus materials.
Absolutely.
It does add another stage to the research, but it's not a major stage. Yes, exactly. It's quite small. With anchoring, we can use anti-anchoring strategies in the discussion guide. For instance, as you said, like the bucket in the street or the red envelopes or the helping crisis or the sick children. We have to, I suppose it means being aware of those and having in the discussion guide pre-prepared strategies to overcome them. One that I find a bit more difficult is framing. And we've talked about creating concepts which frame the issue in different ways, but I think we've done that quite well in the past without behavioural economics.
Oh, we have. And that's possibly true of several of the things here. The difference is that what we've probably done before is done it ad hoc. And the point about behavioural economics, or the point that I'm making, I guess, is that we need to plan this. So we need to anticipate that we might need to reframe in the middle of a discussion or in the middle of an interview, spontaneously, possibly, but we need to anticipate that. It's about planning. It's about taking a more thorough approach to planning an interview or group based on how people think and the biases and heuristics in their thinking.
Well, I like the rigor idea. I mean, I think the one, especially to do with the status quo bias, where we would have the need to frame questions about defaults as well as active choices, is one of the most exciting, for me, aspects of BE, because I think that's something that, you know, sort of does come under the heading of new in a very broad sense. And we're going to say also something about the attribution error. That to me is not as different. I mean, we do challenge thinking. A good researcher will always, in our groups, we will always challenge people's thinking if it seems to be displaying that sort of error. So I don't think that's a new thing for BE, although...
What I meant by that was that we've known from psychology for a long time that if I'm talking about something that I've done wrong, I will typically blame the circumstances for that. But if I see someone else do something wrong, I will typically say that it's a character or a personality flaw of theirs, and I'm not just talking about me, I'm talking about everyone. We know that it's a way that people think. It's a heuristic. It's a part of cognition. And it's really, and you find it in charity work in that you'll typically find that people will spontaneously blame victims for being victims, that the homeless are homeless because it's their fault. And so what we need to do from that perspective, and this applies to lots of other kind of work, is to anticipate that and to have something built into our topic guide which anticipates that we need to at least cover that.
Yeah. Okay. And then there's the social desirability bias, and I think that's the context that Ray was talking about to a large extent, and the lack of two-way mirrors that you were talking about earlier on. I think we need an authentic context, whether that be in home or whether we can revisit the much maligned affinity groups, and it can be doing it in store or in retail outlets. But that's a good thing to do as well. That's something the BE can reinforce for us. And then when we report with a BE perspective, as Bree said earlier, we will be reporting to clients in terms of predicting behavioural change and incorporating that into strategy. So it will be how to use the right behavioural triggers, for instance. It will be delineating the differences between biases, between emotional responses, between social and cultural influences. And I see that we have done that before. I would feel that, in a good research report we would always note those things, but we haven't necessarily done it, and this is where I am in tune with BE fully, I think. We haven't necessarily done it with such rigour in such a scientific way, and I think that can be nothing but good for us as researchers.
Yeah.
And the other thing is how to influence choice, ways to overcome defaults, and using choice architecture. So recommendations about upgrading or switching behaviour might focus more clearly or change the emphasis on moving people away from a default rather than towards a new decision.
I think potentially this is one of the most likely causes of the failure of research in new product development, which of course we all know about. We focus too much on the things that expecting people to change when actually they're perfectly happy with the way they are, and we haven't really understood how to move people away from from those defaults. Haven't understood their loss aversion as well as we should.
And then finally, how to use the context as part of the mix, whether it's social, cultural, or physical, as we've sort of discussed before. It's important that becomes part of the strategy as well.
Oops. I just pressed that twice. I did have to go back. Apologies. So, we believe that behavioural economics can help research because it forces us to reconsider what we're doing. We don't have to abandon it. So it forces us to reconsider how we design and conduct core work, how we interpret it and present it, how we make it as scientifically valid as possible, which is not something that's typically talked about with qualitative research, but it seriously has to be. And although we haven't brought up this point before, it's very important, but it's also how we define the qualitative canon for new researchers. What skills are we teaching the people who are new to the industry?
And still to remember that best practice qual techniques endure as the framework for any model.
Indeed.
I like my man.
So we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.